He and his dog found a pipe in the middle of the desert, but where it led shocked everyone. See what the desert had been hiding all this time. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The valley lay still beneath the first pale light, a stretch of ochre and stone that seemed to breathe in the silence. Wind moved slowly through the sagebrush, carrying the faint scent of iron and dust, the smell of something old and enduring. Michael Henderson sat on the front steps of his house with a tin cup cooling in his hands. The coffee had gone bitter hours ago, but he held it anyway, more for the weight than the warmth. The house was small, a patchwork of salvaged wood and rusted tin, crouched against the edge of the desert like a creature too tired to move. Beyond it, the land rolled into nothingness. It was the kind of place where the horizon had no edges, and the quiet had its own kind of gravity. He had come here 5 years ago, after too many years of service and too little sleep. The army had trained him to hear danger in the smallest things: the click of a loose rifle pin, the hum of a power line, the subtle tremor before a blast. Out here, there were no such sounds, only the wind and the low whine of insects at dusk. Sometimes, if he listened hard enough, he could still hear the echo of rotors overhead, or the bark of gunfire carried through memory. It didn't frighten him anymore. It was simply the sound of what used to be his life. The only constant presence he trusted now was Ray, his black German shepherd. The dog had served, too, a bomb detection unit in Kabul before shrapnel near his right ear dulled his hearing. They were both veterans of noise who had come here to learn the language of silence. Ray spent most mornings stretched in the shade by the porch, watching the empty distance as though it might change. Every so often, he would lift his head, sniff the wind, then settle again, satisfied that the world was still holding together. Michael's days followed a pattern that rarely broke. He rose before dawn, repaired what could still be mended, and took the truck into town twice a week to pick up supplies. The locals called him the quiet mechanic. They knew he didn't talk much, but when he did, he meant it. He fixed old generators, patched irrigation pumps, and rewired broken appliances, work that kept his hands busy and his mind still. When he returned to his house, he ate canned food, warmed on a small stove, then sat on the porch as the desert dimmed into gray. Nights were colder than they should have been. The wind came down from the ridges like a living thing, whispering through the cracks in the boards. In that hush, he could feel his pulse slow, almost in rhythm with the earth itself. Sometimes the quiet unsettled him. He would wake in the small hours to a soundless room and the memory of flares against black skies. The mind never forgot the places it had survived. Yet he preferred this unease to the noise of cities, to the voices that pretended to know what war cost. Out here, there were no speeches, no apologies, just the steady truth of wind, stone, and distance. On the morning when everything began, the air carried the dry scent of a coming storm. Michael noticed it as soon as he stepped outside. The light was sharp, colorless, the kind that bleaches even the shadows. He watched the horizon for a long time, then whistled for Ray. The dog trotted over, tail low, eyes bright. They set off toward the old riverbed beyond the property line, following a path carved by decades of runoff and erosion. It wasn't much of a river, just a shallow scar winding through rock and dust. But Michael liked the way it shaped the land, as if reminding everything around it that even stone could be worn down given enough time. He often found remnants of the past out there: twisted wire, dented canteens, a length of chain half buried in sand. The desert had a habit of hiding things only to return them later, sun-bleached and silent. That morning, he almost walked past it. The glint caught his eye just as the sun broke over the ridge, a small flash of metal cutting through the dust. He crouched, brushing the sand aside with his fingers. Beneath it lay a section of pipe, dull silver under the dirt. At first, he thought it was just a remnant of old irrigation, but when he followed it a few yards, it didn't end. It continued straight, vanishing beneath another rise of sand. He frowned, tracing the edge with his boot. The pipe was thick, heavy-gauge steel, maybe industrial. It looked old, but intact, its surface weathered rather than broken. He followed it for several meters, then several more. It went on and on, cutting a perfect line through the wasteland. Ray began to grow restless. The dog paced ahead, sniffing at the pipe, then turned back toward him with a low growl that seemed more confused than angry. "Easy," Michael murmured. The dog's ears tilted forward, then flattened again. The air felt strange, charged, like before lightning. He knelt, tapping the metal with a wrench he carried in his pack. The sound came back dull, not hollow as he expected. Whatever was inside, it wasn't empty. He tried again, harder. This time, a faint vibration traveled through the pipe, a trembling so subtle he could have imagined it. He pressed his palm to the surface. For a second, he thought he felt a pulse, steady and mechanical, deep below. Then it was gone. He stood, looking toward the horizon. The pipe stretched in both directions, unbroken as far as he could see. It didn't belong to any utility grid he knew of, and it wasn't on the county maps he kept in his house. The military had abandoned this sector decades ago, and no mining operations had ever been registered here. Still, it was too precise, too deliberate to be random. He marked the spot with a stone and walked another half-mile before stopping. The pipe continued without deviation, a buried artery running beneath the land. He couldn't shake the thought that it was leading somewhere, or away from something. By the time he turned back, the wind had picked up. Fine grains of sand lifted around his boots, whispering across the ground. The dog pressed close to his leg, uneasy. When they reached the house, Michael went straight to the shed, pulling out old survey maps. None of them mentioned pipelines or construction in this region. The area was marked simply as Abandoned Zone B. He ran a finger over the faded lines, then looked up through the window toward the ridge, the same ridge where the pipe disappeared. He tried to push it from his mind that night, but the thought clung to him. The desert wasn't supposed to hum. It wasn't supposed to pulse. Yet as he lay in bed, the sound returned. Faint, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Ray stirred beside the bed, ears twitching. Michael rose quietly, stepping outside. The air was cool, the stars sharp above the horizon. The valley lay dark, vast, indifferent. He stood there for a long time, listening. Nothing but the whisper of wind and the crack of settling wood. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of the mind, the residue of old instincts that refused to fade. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something beneath the ground had stirred that morning when he uncovered the pipe, as if the desert itself had opened an eye. By dawn, his decision was made. He packed a rucksack with water, a flashlight, a wrench, a compass, and the small shovel he'd carried through years of war. Ray followed him wordlessly, as if sensing the resolve in his movements. Together, they crossed the field, the sun at their backs, the air already hot and shimmering. When they reached the spot where the pipe vanished beneath the dunes, he began to clear more sand. The metal stretched further than he had thought, perfectly aligned, unbroken, too deliberate to be the work of chance. He followed it until the horizon bent out of sight. For the first time in years, Michael felt a faint current of anticipation, the same restless curiosity that had once driven him to disarm hidden devices in foreign soil. He had thought he'd buried that part of himself along with the noise of war, but here it was again. The quiet hunger for understanding, for the truth hidden below the surface. As the day burned toward noon, he wiped the sweat from his face and squinted into the distance. The pipe gleamed faintly under the sun, a dull metallic thread that seemed to run straight into the heart of the land. Somewhere out there, it ended. Or began. And whatever waited at the end, he knew he wouldn't be able to leave it alone. That night, he sat again on the porch, the cup of cold coffee untouched beside him. The desert was silent, but it was no longer the same kind of silence. It was deeper now, heavier, filled with the weight of something unseen. The wind brushed past the walls of the house, whispering across the sand like a voice too soft to catch. Ray lifted his head and listened, ears pricked toward the horizon. Michael followed his gaze. Out there, somewhere beneath the surface, the desert was breathing. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he knew that tomorrow he would follow that breath, wherever it led. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. By the next morning, the valley no longer looked like the same place. The sand had shifted in the night, scouring the edges of the hills, leaving new scars across the plain. When Michael stepped outside, the air felt heavier, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. He stood for a moment on the porch, watching the horizon flicker under the heat, then shouldered his rucksack. Ray circled near the truck, restless, sensing the change in his master's rhythm. They set out before the sun had cleared the ridge, retracing yesterday's path through the riverbed. The pipe waited for them beneath a thin layer of dust, a straight metallic scar stretching into the wasteland. Michael knelt beside it, tracing its length with his gloved fingers. The surface was cool, smooth, almost unnaturally so for something exposed to decades of desert heat. He had spent enough years handling machinery to know when something was alive with current. And this thing, whatever it was, had a pulse. He followed it eastward, past the broken fence posts and the line of sun-baked rocks that once marked a property boundary. The pipe cut through everything with surgical precision, unbending and unyielding. A mile further, the sand grew coarser, streaked with clay and fragments of concrete. Rusted bolts poked from the ground, the remnants of some forgotten foundation. Michael recognized the pattern, a grid layout typical of industrial installations. He crouched and brushed away the top layer of sand. There, buried in the dust, was a slab of reinforced concrete with a faded stenciled warning. Property of West Horizons, Mining and Chemical. He exhaled slowly. The name stirred something in his memory, an article he had once read about a facility shut down after an environmental accident. The location had never been disclosed. Standing there now, with the wind curling around him and the pipe humming under his boots, he realized he might be standing on top of it. The pipe disappeared beneath a low ridge of sandstone. Following it required climbing a slope that crumbled underfoot. Ray hesitated halfway, whining softly. Michael turned back. "Stay close," he said, his voice dry from the heat. When they reached the crest, he saw it. A circular metal plate, half buried at the base of the hill, ringed by bolts the size of his fists. It looked like the entrance to a buried tank or bunker. The pipe dove straight into it and vanished underground. He brushed away more sand, revealing embossed letters. Sector 12, Ventilation Access. A smaller set of numbers was etched near the rim, stamped by a machine long since rusted to silence. There was no lock, only a thick handle caked in dust. He gripped it with both hands and pulled. The handle resisted, then gave with a shriek that echoed down into the unseen dark. A rush of cool air met him, stale, metallic, smelling faintly of oil and rust. He leaned closer, flashlight in hand. The beam vanished into the depths of a narrow shaft with a ladder descending into darkness. Ray barked once, sharp and uneasy. Michael hesitated. He had no reason to go down, no one waiting for him to come back. And yet the old part of his mind, the soldier, the engineer, itched to understand what lay beneath. He looped Ray's leash around a rock, murmured, "Stay," and started down the ladder. The metal rungs were slick with condensation, cold against his palms. 10 feet down, then 20. The air grew thicker, carrying the faint hum of machinery. He paused to listen. There was no sound of movement, only the low mechanical throb of something ancient still running far below. When his boots touched solid ground, he switched on his flashlight. The beam cut through dust that hung like smoke. A narrow corridor stretched ahead, walls lined with corroded pipes and faded labels. Pressure main, coolant flow, Section 4. He ran his fingers over the lettering. This wasn't an old mine. It was part of a containment system, maybe even a buried facility. The ground beneath his feet vibrated slightly, just enough to make the dust tremble on the floor. He moved slowly, stepping over debris, a twisted wrench, a helmet crushed flat, a trail of shoe prints pressed into the grime. He knelt. The prints were too clean to be decades old. Whoever made them had been here recently. He followed them deeper into the tunnel, where the air cooled and the hum grew louder. The corridor opened into a chamber large enough to hold a small vehicle. Rusted machines loomed in the dark like sleeping beasts. Gauges lined the walls, their needles frozen at 0, though one small panel still flickered weakly. On a nearby table lay a thick notebook. He picked it up carefully. The cover was cracked, but inside, the writing was fresh, jagged pencil lines pressed into the paper with the urgency of someone who had been writing in the dark. He flipped through the pages. Most of the notes were technical. Pressure levels, chemical identifiers, valve positions. Then came a line that froze him. System unstable. Do not power down. Coolant manual adjustment required every 72 hours. The date beside it was less than 3 months old. Michael looked around the chamber. A small generator sat in the corner, its surface clean, the fuel gauge showing half a tank. Someone had been maintaining it. The realization settled over him with the weight of a command he hadn't volunteered for. This place wasn't abandoned. He walked toward the far wall, where a heavy door stood slightly ajar. The flashlight beam caught a warning symbol, a black trefoil on a yellow field. Radiation hazard. The paint was flaking, but the message was clear. He hesitated, then pushed the door open with his shoulder. The room beyond was smaller, colder. A row of metal containers lined the floor, each stamped with serial numbers and the same company emblem. One lay on its side, dented but sealed. The air smelled faintly of ammonia, and something sharper beneath it, a chemical tang that clung to the back of his throat. A single light bulb swung overhead, fed by a thin wire that vanished into the ceiling. It flickered once, twice, then steadied. He knelt beside the nearest container, tracing the label with a trembling hand. Waste product, C-84, handle with care. He had seen containers like these before, years ago, stored in depots overseas, where the soil still reeked of fuel and decay. Didn't take a scientist to know what it meant. The company hadn't shut down its operations here. It had buried them. He flipped another page of the notebook and found an entry written in shaky script. Cooling system compromised. External oversight discontinued. Continued maintenance essential. Do not leave unattended. There was no signature, only initials. DKL. A sound broke the silence, a faint mechanical click, followed by a distant whirring that rose and fell like a heartbeat. He turned toward the corridor. The generator was still off. This noise came from deeper below, beyond the sealed door. He killed the flashlight and listened. The hum became steadier, rhythmic, pulsing through the walls. It was alive. For a moment, instinct told him to retreat, to climb the ladder and fill the shaft with concrete, to forget this place existed. But curiosity, that old dangerous companion, wouldn't let go. He edged toward the source, careful not to disturb the debris underfoot. The passage sloped downward into another tunnel lined with insulated pipes. Here the air grew wet and heavy, thick with chemical moisture. He found another door, this one locked but recently oiled. He pressed his ear against it and caught something impossible, the faint echo of movement. A single step, soft and deliberate. Someone was down there. He stepped back, heart thudding. The soldier in him assessed the situation automatically. One entrance, poor ventilation, limited visibility. Whoever was inside had the advantage. He switched off his light and waited in the dark. The sound came again. Metal against metal. Deliberate. Careful. Then silence. After what felt like hours, he turned and climbed back to the main chamber, every instinct urging him upward. Ray's barking echoed faintly through the shaft above. The sound was almost a relief, a reminder of sunlight and air. He pocketed the notebook, turned off the light, and began the climb. Halfway up, the ladder shuddered beneath his weight. He froze. A low vibration passed through the metal, like the echo of distant machinery waking from sleep. The pipe outside must have reactivated. The whole structure was alive again. He pushed upward, every muscle tight, until at last he saw the thin line of daylight above. When he emerged, the air hit him like a wave of heat. Ray bounded toward him, whining and pressing his body against Michael's leg. The veteran dropped to his knees, hand on the dog's head, eyes locked on the open hatch. From inside came a faint exhalation of air, a sigh as if the earth itself had let something go. Then it stilled. He dragged the cover back into place and heaved a pile of sand over it until the outline disappeared. For a long moment he stood there, staring at the featureless ground. The wind had picked up again, lifting small spirals of dust around his boots. By the time he reached the house, the sun was setting, painting the hills in rust and gold. He washed his hands at the sink, but the metallic scent clung stubbornly to his skin. The notebook lay on the table beside a flickering lamp. He opened it again, rereading the last entries until the words blurred. Do not leave unattended. That night, the desert seemed to breathe beneath him. He could feel the faint vibration through the floorboards, a steady pulse running through the ground, like the heartbeat of something vast and unseen. Ray paced restlessly near the door, growling low. Michael didn't tell him to stop, because somewhere deep down, he knew the dog was right. The silence outside was no longer silence at all. It was the sound of something sleeping, and something else still awake beneath it. The following morning came without dawn. The desert sky was veiled in dust, the sun rising behind a dull haze that turned everything the color of ash. Michael sat at his table with the notebook open, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges, the handwriting inside sharp and uneven. The initials at the bottom of the last entry, DKL, stared back at him like a signature from a ghost. Ray lay under the window, restless, his ears twitching to every distant vibration that seemed to ripple beneath the house. The hum had returned sometime in the night, low and steady, the same pulse he had felt in the tunnel. It wasn't imagination. It had a rhythm, a mechanical persistence, as though the desert itself had found its heartbeat again. Each tremor seemed to throb faintly through the ground, through the floorboards, through him. He closed the notebook and leaned back, listening. The sound wasn't constant. It ebbed and grew, almost alive. He tried to focus on ordinary things. Breakfast, the sound of the wind, the kettle hissing on the stove. But the thoughts kept circling back to that hatch in the ridge and the message scrawled on the wall. If you find this, don't turn it off. He thought about the containers stacked in that cold chamber, the markings on their sides, the faint trace of chemicals in the air. It had been decades since the company folded, but something was still breathing down there. Someone had been keeping it alive. He pushed the chair back and walked outside. The valley stretched before him, silent except for the wind that hissed through the dried grass. From here, he could almost see the ridge, faint and gray against the horizon. He stood there for a long time, the thought turning over and over in his mind until it hardened into decision. He wasn't the kind of man who could walk away from a system left running on borrowed time. By noon, he had packed what he needed: rope, flashlight, batteries, water, the camera he rarely used. Ray followed him without question, though the dog's movements were slower, hesitant, as if he too remembered what lay beneath that mound of sand. The drive to the ridge was silent. The tires stirred up clouds of dust that hung behind the truck like smoke. When he reached the site, he found the sand disturbed. The cover of the hatch wasn't buried anymore. Someone, or something, had brushed it clean. The metal gleamed faintly, as though it had been touched recently. He stood there, pulse tightening, and felt again the strange hum in the soles of his boots. He pulled the cover aside and peered down. The air that came up was cooler than he remembered, tinged with the metallic scent of oil and old water. The ladder shimmered faintly in the light. Ray growled low, almost whispering. Michael ran a hand along the dog's head. "Stay up here. If I'm not back in 2 hours, you know where to go." He didn't know if Ray understood, but the dog's eyes followed him as he descended into the dark. The shaft swallowed the daylight. Halfway down, his flashlight caught the outline of rusted bolts, old warning signs, the same stains on the metal walls. But there were new footprints in the dust on the landing, faint, but there. The notebook hadn't lied. Someone had been maintaining the system. He moved down the corridor, sweeping the beam from wall to wall. The hum grew louder now, more deliberate. He reached the first chamber and found it changed. The generator in the corner had been moved closer to the wall, its cables replaced with newer ones. The fuel can beside it was almost full. On the table, the notebook was gone. In its place lay a small wrench, clean and recently used. The chair had been pulled out slightly, as though someone had just stood up. "Hello?" His voice echoed through the metal tunnels, thin and uneven. No answer. Only the steady breathing of machines. He walked on, tracing the path toward the sealed room. The door to the containment vault stood open this time. The air that drifted from it was cold, damp, heavy with the stench of corrosion and chemical residue. The containers were still there, but one was missing from the line. A trail of drag marks led deeper into the shadows. Michael followed them. The floor trembled faintly under his boots. Further down, the tunnel widened into another section he hadn't noticed before. A maintenance hall lined with dials and pressure valves. Some glowed faintly green. Others ticked between numbers, as though guided by an unseen hand. There, against one of the panels, lay a set of tools, and beside them, a small lantern still burning. He crouched. The flame flickered, feeding on a nearly empty reservoir. The wick was trimmed, recent. Someone had been here minutes, maybe hours ago. He turned slowly, scanning the darkness. "You here?" he said softly, not expecting a reply. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a sound, a soft clang, far off like a door closing in another corridor. He raised the flashlight and caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the beam. A shadow, human-shaped, vanishing into the dark. He froze, every instinct sharpened by years of training. Whoever it was didn't want to be found. But the shadow hadn't moved with the panic of fear. It had been deliberate, measured, a person protecting something. He stepped forward, then stopped himself. This wasn't combat. Whoever lived here was the last thread holding this system together. He backed away slowly, lowering the light. "I'm not here to shut it down," he said, his voice steady now. "I just needed to know." The air around him hummed in reply, as though the whole structure had heard. He turned back toward the shaft, the glow of the lantern fading behind him. Before leaving, he paused near the main generator. On the wall, in the same chalk as before, was a new line: pressure stable. Do not disturb the cycle. Beneath it, smaller letters, a single word: still here. When he emerged into daylight, the wind had shifted again. The horizon rippled under the heat, and the sound beneath the sand was softer now, almost gentle. Ray bounded up, circling him, tail low but wagging. Michael scratched behind his ear, smiling faintly. "He's still down there," he said quietly, not sure if he was speaking to the dog or the desert. That evening, he sat by the table and began recording everything: the maps, the coordinates, the notebook's contents from memory, the symbols on the containers, the warnings on the walls. He took photographs of the ridge and the hatch, the exact markings on the surface. Then he wrote a short letter addressed to a journalist he had once met during a veterans outreach project, someone who had written about abandoned military facilities. He described the system in careful, factual terms, ending with a line that felt almost like confession. "If I am wrong, nothing happens. If I am right, this keeps us alive." The next morning, he drove to town and mailed the package, then turned the truck back toward the valley. The radio played static most of the way, catching fragments of weather updates and distant voices. None of them mentioned anything about chemical waste or forgotten mines. The world above still went on, oblivious. Back home, the hum was fainter, but constant, a background tone that had become part of the landscape. He spent the afternoon repairing the fence, the motions automatic, the thoughts drifting. Once, while hammering a nail, he felt the earth vibrate again, a slow, deep shiver that rolled underfoot. He paused, hand on the post, listening. It was no longer just mechanical. It sounded like the heartbeat of something breathing deep below. As dusk settled, he climbed the ridge one last time, carrying a small tin plate he had polished and engraved the night before. Ray followed close behind. When they reached the hatch, he placed the plate in the sand above it, securing it with stones. The engraving caught the dying light of the sun, to those who kept the earth breathing, unseen, unnamed, unforgotten. He stood there until the horizon dimmed to violet, the desert falling quiet around him. The hum continued beneath his feet, steady and sure. It no longer frightened him. It was proof of endurance, of something that refused to die even when the world above had turned away. When the stars began to appear, he turned back toward the house. Ray trotted beside him, pausing once to look back. Michael followed the dog's gaze to the ridge. For a brief moment, a faint glow shimmered there, not bright enough to be seen from town, but enough to show that something below still moved, still worked, still lived. He smiled. The wind swept down from the hills, warm and dry, carrying the faint scent of oil and dust, the smell of purpose. For the first time in years, he felt no need to run from it. The war in his head was quiet now. The desert no longer felt empty. Somewhere below, a man, or maybe just the echo of one, kept the pumps alive, and the world stayed intact because of it. As Michael and Ray descended the ridge, the hum blended with the wind until the two were indistinguishable. He didn't look back again. Some things, he understood now, were meant to remain unseen, not out of fear, but because they had already given enough. By the time he reached the porch, night had settled completely. The stars were scattered wide and cold, and the valley lay in shadow. Inside, the lamp burned softly. He poured a cup of water for Ray, and one for himself, sat by the open door and listened. Beneath the house, deep in the earth, the pulse continued, slow, patient, eternal. The sound of the world still breathing. Watch the other videos on the channel, and share this one with someone who loves a good mystery.